Section 2. When I had completed the transaction, I went back to the robot website for a second look at what I had purchased. Emma had an Asian face with long black hair, falling seductively over two ripe, beautifully formed breasts. Her hypnotic brown eyes stared out at me with a wanton look begging me to come closer, in their "I want to be your pillow friend" sort of way. Red lipstick accentuated her luscious, thick lips, which gave my imagination pleasure at the thought of kissing them. I couldn't stop wondering why the manufacturers included a vagina in this model. I wondered if it smelled like a real one. "Say what? I thought you weren't interested in having sex with this robot." There was that voice again. No matter how hard I tried to ignore the existence of a subconscious mind in my life's decisions, it constantly made cameo appearances in my reality. I'm okay with this subconscious intruder, as I spend most of the day ignoring him and putting him in the back of my mind, where he belongs. Unfortunately, today he's been right up in the forefront of my mind. I'm not interested in the robot for sex, I told myself, trying to make myself believe the words I was saying. "Yes, you are," insisted my subconscious. "I heard you talking. You can't deny what you're thinking to me, you know. I'm physiologically attached to you. Every thought you have had since birth, I have stored away in my centre for idle thoughts and dumb acts. You should see the mess that has gathered over the years. It looks like the aftermath of a train wreck. That's why I've decided to clear some of your old thoughts. Don't throw my things out. I plan on using all of that stuff one day." "One day? I don't have to remind you that you are going on 65. You've outgrown most of these old thoughts. You need to make room for new thoughts, like this new female robot you've purchased." "Why are you pushing that wheelbarrow full of stuff?" I asked. I had to keep a good eye on my subconscious. It acts like it's the boss of me. I reached into his wheelbarrow and pulled out a white rag. "What is this old thing?" I asked, giving it a good shake. Several aging moths and a half-dozen silverfish fell lazily to the floor. "That is what's left of your kung fu uniform. You remember the kung fu classes you took when you were 10? "Actually, I don't remember them," I said, reflectively stroking my chin. "You don't remember because you knocked yourself out with a pair of nunchakus. You were the first student at that school who went from a white belt to a yellow belt, up to a brown belt. Then, after several falls and miscalculations, you nosedived back to a white belt." "I'm glad I can't remember," I said, noticing a wine barrel in the barrow. "I don't remember drinking a barrel full of wine. Why is the barrel all smashed to pieces?" "You didn't drink any wine. You were only 12 at the time. You and 3 of your friends decided it would be adventurous to climb inside the barrow and roll off a cliff." I have a vague recollection of that ride. As I remember, the 4 of us were thrown out of the barrel before it went over the hill. "Cliff? Oh, I'm sure it was a small hill. It most certainly was a 40-metre drop off a cliff. The barrel smashed into pieces on the rocks at the bottom. You are very lucky to be alive. I might remind you that if you kill yourself, I will be affected the same as you. I'm throwing your stuff out before you get any more death-defying thoughts. You don't have to worry about that sort of thing with the female robot," I said, adjusting the screen so he could view it better. He came closer to my side and then crawled up onto my desk for a clearer view. "She is quite pretty," he said, once close enough to the screen to get a proper view. "I know," I said, giving an appreciative sigh. I picked those lovely brown eyes, and the long black hair gives her a youthful appearance. "And the breasts were your idea as well?" he questioned. "Yes," I replied. "What about the mouth, nose and skin?" "Yes, on all 3 accounts," I said in a dream state. "I suppose you designed the shape of her legs and the patch of pubic hair." He moved closer to me but kept viewing the screen. "So, what you are saying is that you had a say in the design of all the robot's body parts. Does that include the vaginal parts?" "Especially the vagina parts," I said proudly. I took great care in making the dimensions to my specifications. It has to be able to be removed and cleaned hygienically after use. Have you ever had words come out of your mouth, and at the same time, regret stabbed you in the ribs with a pitchfork? My subconscious mind turned slowly to face me. His nose nearly touched mine. His eyes were glowing with signs of victory. He put his forehead onto mine, staring me straight in the eyes. And you want me to believe you weren't thinking about having sex with that robot? You can't lie to your subconscious mind. It's the only one who knows your deepest, darkest secrets. I read somewhere once that a secret shared is no longer a secret. I would have to get rid of my subconscious mind. But then what would I replace it with? I have a confession to make. I am terrible at waiting. I am always early for an appointment. If someone is 5 minutes late for that appointment, I leave and don't return their calls. I don't join queues either. One of my many reasons for leaving England and moving to Australia was my inability to join a queue and wait. In England, you enter a queue and wait to join the main queue. The only good thing I received from queue spotting was reading a quote on a sign outside an entertainment centre in London, which read, "Before entering the box, always make sure your exit is clear." This manly advice has served me well over the years, and so far, I've always found my exit unencumbered. Now, the reason I'm making this confession is that the robot company sent me an email stating that they needed 4 weeks of lead time. This means I sent them my money and must wait 4 weeks before they send me my product, and another 4 weeks for delivery. They say that the robot needs to be assembled in China. Now, at what point do I start to be concerned? Have I been scammed? My email went straight to the point. How do I know this isn't a scam? Their reply email shot down my point. You don't. Be patient. Read a book. The robot is being constructed to individual customers' requests. I don't know what came over me, but I was feeling apologetic, so I sent an email back. Sorry, it's just that when I spend this much money, I don't feel comfortable waiting for 2 months. I hope you don't mind me asking questions. That was the last I heard from them for 8 weeks. It was apparent that I was not important enough for a proper reply. During that waiting time, I decided to tell my wife about my robot order. I needed a plan of action. I didn't want to engage in a long-winded conversation. It was totally impossible for my wife and me to climb aboard the conversation bus at Central Station, have the same destination with one subject to talk about, and end up at our destination without the bus making several detours and eventually ending up in a ditch or ravine nowhere near our original destination. At least I was making an effort to involve her in my plan. I found my wife in the kitchen playing on her iPad. When she was on it, her attention was limited to finger-punching the screen. Carrying on a conversation could take her a while to respond to questions. Don. You know I've been talking about, careful now, reminded the little voice in my head. Avoid the word, bye for now, getting one of those robot dolls. Wife. Yes, dear. Voice. The stage is set. Proceed with caution and prepare for battle. Don. Well, I ordered one online. She never stopped poking the picture on the screen. I wasn't sure she heard me properly as I wasn't talking through anything solid, like a brick wall. She certainly must listen better through solid objects, as she is always initiating conversations from a room other than the one I'm in. Maybe she needed the wall to filter through the idle babble which makes up some of her conversation. And then she began sucking in air. This was her prelude to most conversations with me. Firstly, she would gather in as much air as her lungs could accommodate. Then, when the lungs had reached full capacity, she let out a gust of wind in my general direction. What did it cost? $5,000, I replied. Where did you get $5,000? I saved it up. Why didn't you give it to me to save for you? That's not called saving. That's called donating. When you donate something, you don't expect to get it back. If you have so much money, you can pay the gas and electric bills that just came in. The garage door needs repairing. The spare room needs painting. You know my mother is coming to visit. You promised to fix the front door screen, and then there's... Hang on a moment. What's this about your mother visiting? When? I told you she was coming last month. You never listened to me. I must admit, I don't really listen to what she says because most of it is diversion matter. It very rarely has anything to do with the initial subject matter. We have to pick her up at the airport. Again. When? Now. On our way to the airport, she kept punching her finger onto the screen of her iPad with intermittent words aimed in my direction. And where do you plan on storing this robot you ordered? You're not storing it in my house. It was hard separating her from her iPad. She even played with it while we were having sex. Make that while I'm having sex. I hadn't thought of an answer to her storage question, so I let the subject drop until I had an adequate answer. She wouldn't notice that I hadn't answered her question because the question would come up again one day during another conversation. With her way of having conversations, information never really gets lost. It just enters into a holding pattern and waits for the moment the conversation takes off in another direction for it to slip back in, unnoticed, back into the playing field. I imagine, in her head, there's a ship full of information colliding with other ships, and not one of those accidental collisions would come with an apology. Her apology centre had large, rusted chains welded to the door. No power on earth could remove those chains. Her mother was the same. They both were characterised as blame shifters. While they are blaming you for their mistakes, it takes the light from them and places it squarely onto your shoulders. This is one reason you make your soon-to-be spouse answer a questionnaire before jumping blindly into a compromising matrimonial relationship. I found a parking place at the airport near the terminal exit door. I knew it wouldn't be difficult to find a walking stone pillar, especially one that hadn't smiled since birth. The surgeon that pulled her mother out of Cave 69 slapped her across the arse so hard he dislodged her sense of humour. She became an instant man-hater. Her stone-cold face was like a Cabbage Patch doll after being mauled by a farmer's runaway tractor. We greeted each other in the same seasoned-old ritualistic fashion. I ignored her, and she ignored me. She couldn't read or write, spoke not a word of English, and spoke one of those Asian dialects that only her daughter and she could converse in. The funny thing was that her mother stayed for 2 weeks, but I can't remember any of her stay. I locked myself away in my study, which is a few metres from the main house, and stayed there for the duration of my mother-in-law's visit. So, I was back at the airport dropping off the Ancient One. During her stay, she had defrosted just enough to extend her hand toward me in a goodbye gesture. She placed a cold, dead prehistoric fossil into my extended palm, and I shook it. There was no need to shake it, as it had become petrified, and no manner of shaking was going to resuscitate the stiff little relic. She smiled at me with the same face one makes while trying to have a bowel movement after a bout of constipation. My wife walked her mother into the terminal, which I thought termination appropriate for a venomous old reptile. She got herself settled for the long journey back to China. My wife's father had passed away 10 years earlier, so the old bat hung out with one or more of her 10 children who looked after her during the day. You would think with the old man impregnating her regularly, she was wife number 1. He had 3 wives and families waiting in the dusty corridors of China, that she would have been something to be desired in her youth. Maybe the passing of all those babies sucked out all the goodness that was inside of her. Anyway, I was glad to see the back of her. My wife jumped back into the car and we sped from the terminal. About 5 minutes into the drive, my wife said, with no prompting from me, "You're not putting her in the study either. I'm playing mahjong there this afternoon." My wife often started conversations smack dab in the middle with no regard for sentence structure or timing. She spoke her version of Chinglish. There was no warning or guide to steer you through the mixture of two different ways of approaching communication, which sifted through the daily data stacked in piles, ready for her to bring to any discussion in the blink of an eye. The material she brought forward very rarely had anything to do with the conversation you were having, but by the time you figured out what she was going on about, the subject had changed, and off to the races she went on a fresh steed. "We just dropped your mother off at the airport," I said, trying to navigate onto the main highway. "She won't be staying in the study, so you can play mahjong as long as you like. You have your things all over the place in there. You'll have to keep her out in the shed." "You're not listening to me," I persisted. "We just dropped her off at the airport 20 minutes ago. Don't you remember?"